Scenes 1 and 2 of Another Night in the Valley unfold like a slow exhale after a held breath, using the language of noir and suspense not to sensationalize danger, but to excavate the emotional terrain queer women often inhabit, where intuition, memory, and desire intersect under pressure. Charlotte's Stakeout begins in isolation, a woman alone in a car at night, already signaling a familiar queer reality of watching from the margins, of being present without being visible. And when she falls asleep, it feels less like negligence than exhaustion, the fatigue of someone who has been carrying unanswered questions for too long. The gunshot that jolts her awake is not just a narrative-inciting incident, but a symbolic rupture, a reminder that stillness is temporary, and that buried truths have a way of announcing themselves violently. Entering the house, Charlotte does not behave like a thrill-seeker. Her movements are careful, restrained, guided by a sense of responsibility rather than curiosity, and the discovery of the dead man is framed not as spectacle but as consequence, a stark intrusion of mortality that immediately places her in danger simply for being present. The Polaroids of Veronica shift the scene from crime to intimacy, because photographs, especially analog ones, are artifacts of attention, evidence that someone was seen, wanted, studied, and possibly possessed. For queer audiences, the presence of these images resonates with the uneasy history of being documented through someone else's gaze, often without consent or clarity, and Charlotte's recognition of Veronica among them suggests a web of relational knowledge that law enforcement does not yet see. The arrival of the police car introduces institutional authority, and Aila, the female officer, complicates expectations by embodying both threat and unexpected tenderness. Her instinct to bring Charlotte in reflects the reality that women, particularly queer women, are often presumed guilty when they occupy liminal spaces, yet her choice to let Charlotte go after seeing her ID and offering her number introduces a quiet subversion of procedural coldness. This exchange is charged not with flirtation but with recognition, a moment where two women see each other as more than roles. And for LGBTQ++ viewers, this resonates as the rare relief of being met with nuance instead of suspicion. Back at Charlotte's place, the drinking and smoking are not indulgent, but anesthetic, a way of dulling the edges of fear and responsibility, and her unanswered phone call underscores the loneliness that often accompanies truth-seeking, especially when one has stepped away from former lives. Visiting Dee at the ballet studio marks a tonal shift, moving from darkness into disciplined movement and repetition, and ballet itself becomes a metaphor for control, for bodies trained to express emotion through form rather than confession. Dee's admission that she has not seen Veronica in months, coupled with the mention of a benefactor, reinforces the theme of women navigating survival through dependency, a reality that persists because economic and creative spaces remain unevenly accessible. The revelation that Charlotte, Dee, and Veronica once shared a life in filmmaking reframes their connection as artistic and emotional kinship, not mere coincidence, and Dee's longing for Charlotte emerges as nostalgia layered with desire, the ache of unfinished collaboration and unresolved feeling. Dee's touch is gradual, exploratory, and emotionally legible, not framed as conquest but as reaching, and Charlotte's initial resistance reflects the internal negotiation many queer women experience when desire collides with obligation and fear. Her insistence that she cannot stay long speaks to a learned reflex to limit pleasure, to ration intimacy as if it were a luxury rather than a need. When Charlotte submits to Dee's advances and they kiss, the moment is not eroticized but weighted with history, grief, and longing. A release that feels less like indulgence and more like survival. Society's discomfort with women expressing love for each other is threaded throughout these scenes not through explicit condemnation, but through context. Through the fact that danger arrives before intimacy, that institutions loom large while connection happens in private, and that women's desire is continually framed as secondary to plot, mystery, or crisis. This discomfort persists because women loving women disrupts narratives that prioritize male action and female reaction. And Another Night in the Valley resists this by allowing Charlotte's interior life to drive the story. Each woman Charlotte encounters reflects a different facet of her struggle. Aila represents conditional safety within systems offering help but not refuge. Dee represents shared history and the temptation of returning to a version of oneself that felt alive. Veronica, though absent, embodies the unanswered question, the pull toward truth that cannot be ignored. For queer viewers, these interactions mirror real-world pressures to compartmentalize, to justify feelings as situational rather than essential, and to navigate intimacy under the shadow of consequence. For women more broadly, the film speaks to the tension between responsibility and desire, to the way care for others can eclipse care for the self, and to the fear that choosing connection may derail carefully maintained stability. By grounding its suspense in emotional stakes rather than spectacle, the film challenges the idea that queer stories must be either tragic or titillating, offering instead a portrait of women moving through danger with empathy, restraint, and courage. Charlotte's journey through these scenes is not about solving a crime, but about re-entering herself, about allowing memory and desire to inform action rather than suppressing them in the name of control. The valley of the title becomes both geographic and emotional, a place where echoes linger and where descent is necessary before ascent. And in this space, the film honors the truth that becoming visible is rarely safe, but always necessary. For LGBTQ+ audiences seeking authenticity, these opening scenes offer recognition without simplification, acknowledging that love, fear, and responsibility often arrive together, and that choosing to feel, even briefly, can be an act of defiance against a world that prefers women silent, contained, and alone. Scene 3. Of Another Night in the Valley deepens the film's quiet investigation into queer interior life by placing Charlotte in a landscape where truth, desire, and restraint exist in constant negotiation. And in doing so, it mirrors the emotional vigilance many women, particularly queer women, learn to practice as a means of survival. Charlotte's determination to find Veronica is not framed as professional obsession alone, but as moral insistence, a refusal to let another woman be reduced to rumor, image, or collateral damage. And this insistence carries her to the town property, a space heavy with unspoken history and feminine presence. Meeting Rita first, Charlotte encounters warmth edged with grief, a woman shaped by recent upheaval who still extends courtesy and openness. And the fact that Laura is present but unseen introduces an early motif of partial visibility that runs throughout the scene. Charlotte's choice to leave, rather than interrogate Rita alone, signals her respect for consent and completeness, a subtle but meaningful distinction for queer audiences accustomed to narratives where women are pressured into disclosure for the sake of plot. Laura's later agreement to meet, despite not knowing Veronica, suggests the way women often step toward connection through intuition rather than evidence, a gesture that feels risky yet sincere. Charlotte's conversation with Aila that night functions as both debrief and confession, revealing how professional spaces can become rare sites for emotional honesty when other avenues feel blocked. Aila's knowledge of the town family's recent loss situates the women within a continuum of female endurance, reminding viewers that grief is not an isolated event, but a condition that reshapes households, loyalties, and identities. Her interest in getting to know Charlotte beyond the case underscores a pattern in Charlotte's life, where intimacy brushes against her work repeatedly, suggesting that she has learned to understand herself through others' curiosity rather than self-assertion. For queer viewers, this pattern resonates as a familiar tension between being wanted and being known, between the comfort of attention and the vulnerability of presence. Rita arriving the next morning to take Charlotte out disrupts the controlled rhythm of investigation, inviting her into daylight, movement, and domestic openness, and the tour of the property becomes an act of storytelling without words, a way of sharing family history through land and routine. The invitation to stay the night is layered with hospitality and need, reflecting how women often offer space when they themselves are seeking steadiness, and Charlotte's reluctance reveals her instinct to keep distance when emotional complexity threatens to overwhelm purpose. Laura's encouragement that Charlotte stay reframes the decision as communal rather than personal, and this collective assent mirrors the ways women sometimes authorize one another's desires to make them feel safer or more permissible. The shared kiss between Charlotte and Rita is brief but symbolically dense, not a promise but an acknowledgement, a moment where connection surfaces without demanding resolution. And for LGBTQ+ audiences, this restraint feels honest, honoring how intimacy often begins in fragments rather than declarations. That night, Charlotte's restlessness signals the cost of proximity, the way being surrounded by women who are open with each other can unsettle someone accustomed to holding herself apart, and her wandering through the dark house feels less voyeuristic than searching, a need to orient herself within unfamiliar emotional architecture. Discovering Rita and Laura together confronts Charlotte with a vision of intimacy that exists without her, a quiet but profound reminder that desire is not always reciprocal, and that witnessing others' closeness can provoke both longing and humility. Her decision to watch briefly and then walk away is an act of self-respect, resisting the urge to insert herself into a story that is not hers. And this choice resonates with queer viewers who have learned the painful art of stepping back to preserve dignity. Society's discomfort with women expressing love for each other surfaces here through the film's refusal to sensationalize the moment, presenting it instead as tender, ordinary, and deeply human, challenging the assumption that such connections must be either hidden or dramatized to justify their existence. This discomfort persists because women's relational autonomy threatens structures that rely on competition, secrecy, and male-centered narratives, and by depicting women choosing each other without spectacle, the film quietly subverts those expectations. Each woman in the scene embodies a different relationship to visibility. Charlotte represents the observer, trained to seek truth while guarding her own. Rita embodies openness shaped by loss, willing to reach despite uncertainty. Laura signifies continuity and shared grief, offering validation without dominance. Aila stands for institutional presence softened by personal curiosity. Together, they create an emotional map that reflects real-world pressures on queer women to balance honesty with safety, to read rooms carefully, and to justify their feelings even to themselves. For women more broadly, the scene speaks to the experience of entering spaces marked by others' histories, of navigating attraction amid responsibility, and of recognizing when desire must yield to respect. By grounding its tension in emotional consequence rather than physical action, Another Night in the Valley affirms that visibility is not always about being chosen, but about choosing how to witness, when to step forward, and when to step back. Charlotte's journey through this scene underscores the truth that seeking answers often means confronting one's own boundaries, and that becoming visible to oneself can be as unsettling as uncovering hidden facts. For LGBTQ+ audiences seeking authenticity, this chapter offers a mirror rather than a lesson, honoring the complexity of women's connections and the courage it takes to remain present without possession, to feel without claiming, and to walk away with integrity when the moment calls for restraint. Scene 4 of Another Night in the Valley tightens its emotional grip by collapsing the distance between professional threat and personal vulnerability, revealing how danger so often becomes the context in which queer women are permitted closeness, and how that permission remains fragile, conditional, and fleeting. Charlotte returning home to find her house ransacked is not staged as a spectacle of violence, but as a violation of interior life, the invasion of a space that had functioned as her last refuge. And for many women, this moment resonates as a familiar fear that safety is provisional, easily revoked, and rarely guaranteed by institutions. The presence of the police already on site should signal protection, yet the emotional anchor of the scene is not law enforcement as a system, but Officer Aila as a person, reinforcing the film's ongoing distinction between structures and individuals. Charlotte and Aila's kiss before she leaves is brief, understated, and emotionally charged, not because it promises resolution, but because it acknowledges mutual recognition in the midst of uncertainty. For queer audiences, this moment captures the way intimacy often surfaces in pauses between crises, not as escape, but as grounding, a reminder that connection can exist even when answers do not. Aila's belief that the town's women know something about the ransacking and the disappearance introduces suspicion not as accusation but as intuition, echoing how women are frequently taught to trust their instincts while simultaneously being told those instincts are unreliable. The following morning, Charlotte's decision to confront Mrs. Town is framed less as confrontation and more as reckoning, a choice to seek truth face-to-face rather than through distance or conjecture. Penny's admission that she knows about Veronica's disappearance, but withheld the information complicates the moral landscape, refusing easy binaries of innocence and guilt, and instead presenting secrecy as a strategy born of fear, grief, or self-preservation. Penny's performance of innocence is not caricatured, it is gentle, almost convincing, reflecting how women learn to survive by softening edges, by appearing harmless in situations where being forthright could carry consequences. Charlotte's response to this revelation is telling, as anger does not dominate the exchange. Instead, curiosity, disappointment, and attraction coexist, illustrating the uncomfortable truth that emotional connection does not dissolve in the presence of deception but often deepens in complexity. For lesbian and broader LGBTQ+ viewers, this dynamic resonates as an echo of lived experience, where attraction is sometimes entangled with ambiguity, and where the desire to understand another woman can override the impulse to condemn her outright. Charlotte slowly falling for Penny is not framed as foolishness or betrayal of professional ethics, but as a human response to vulnerability, to the pull of someone who embodies both warmth and withholding. Society's discomfort with women expressing love for each other is quietly interrogated here through the expectation that Charlotte must justify her feelings, first to herself and then to the narrative logic of the investigation. That discomfort persists because women's same-sex intimacy challenges the notion that desire must be either transparent or transactional to be valid, and Penny's secrecy disrupts the demand for immediate legibility. Penny occupies a symbolic role as a woman shaped by loss and proximity to danger, someone who knows more than she says and says less than she feels, mirroring how many women navigate worlds that punish openness. Charlotte, in turn, represents the cost of bearing witness, of wanting truth while craving closeness, and her internal conflict reflects the broader queer tension between self-protection and self-disclosure. For women more broadly, this scene speaks to the experience of realizing that attraction does not always align with safety and that emotional honesty often arrives entangled with compromise. The ransacked house becomes a metaphor for Charlotte's interior state, ordered by intention but vulnerable to intrusion, while Penny's partial confession highlights how withholding information can feel like control in environments where women's narratives are frequently co-opted or dismissed. By centering conversation, glances, and emotional shifts rather than dramatic confrontation, the film challenges the idea that queer tension must be explosive to be meaningful. Instead, it honors the quieter reality that longing often grows in the space between what is said and what is held back. Aila's earlier presence lingers as a counterpoint, representing a form of care that exists within boundaries, reminding viewers that not all connections demand surrender, and that restraint can be a form of respect rather than denial. The pattern of women orbiting Charlotte, each offering a different mode of intimacy, underscores how queer women are often positioned at crossroads of attention, forced to navigate desire without clear scripts or guarantees. Society's unease with women loving women is further exposed through the implication that Charlotte's feelings toward Penny are suspect because Penny is complicated, as if complexity invalidates sincerity, a standard rarely applied to heterosexual narratives. This double bind persists because women are expected to be either caretakers or cautionary tales, not autonomous subjects capable of holding contradiction. Scene 4 resists that reduction by allowing Charlotte to feel without immediately resolving those feelings into action, granting her interiority without punishment. Penny's quiet allure, grounded in vulnerability rather than seduction, invites audiences to consider how attraction often arises from shared uncertainty, from the recognition of another's carefulness as a mirror of one's own. For LGBTQ+ audiences seeking authenticity, this scene offers recognition of how love and suspicion can coexist, and how choosing to remain open in the face of incomplete truth can be an act of courage rather than naivety. The film does not ask viewers to approve of Penny's secrecy or Charlotte's attraction, but to understand them as responses to a world that has taught women to ration trust. In doing so, Another Night in the Valley affirms that becoming visible is not a single moment of confession, but a gradual process of allowing oneself to feel even when certainty is unavailable. By the end of the scene, Charlotte stands not closer to resolution but deeper in relationship, illustrating that the pursuit of truth often transforms the seeker as much as it reveals the sought. This transformation, rooted in empathy rather than spectacle, challenges audiences to reconsider why women's emotional complexity is so often framed as danger rather than depth, and why queer intimacy continues to be treated as something that must be explained away rather than simply lived. Scene 5 of Another Night in the Valley functions as the film's emotional and ethical breaking point, where intimacy, betrayal, and systemic injustice converge to expose how deeply women are conditioned to seek safety in one another, even as larger forces make that safety provisional, negotiable, and painfully fragile. Detective Stokely, unraveling at the end of her tether, reaches out not to an institution, but to a person, calling Sam in desperation, a choice that immediately situates the scene within a queer logic of trust that prioritizes relational bonds over procedural authority. Sam's arrival out of uniform, wearing a dress, subtly disarms the power dynamics typically associated with policing, presenting her not as an enforcer but as a woman stepping into a private space. And this visual shift matters because it signals vulnerability and intimacy rather than control. Charlotte's scream that Veronica is dead, information delivered by Laura Town, is less an announcement of fact than the collapse of hope, the moment when searching transforms into mourning, and her belief that the town's women are responsible reframes the investigation as a confrontation with entrenched power rather than individual malice. For queer audiences, this shift resonates deeply, reflecting the recognition that harm against marginalized women often originates not from random violence but from systems that quietly decide whose lives are expendable. Sam's attempt to quiet Charlotte is tender rather than authoritative, and her impulsive kiss is framed not as interruption but as grounding, a gesture that acknowledges Charlotte's humanity in a moment where her professional identity has failed to protect her from despair. Sam's confession that she has wanted to kiss Charlotte since they first met reframes their relationship as one of long-suppressed mutual recognition, echoing the queer experience of desire that waits for permission, timing, or crisis to surface. This moment of connection, set against the flashing neon hotel sign outside the window, situates their intimacy within a transient liminal space, emphasizing how queer closeness often unfolds in borrowed rooms and temporary shelters, rather than stable domesticity. The film carefully avoids spectacle, focusing instead on the emotional exchange, the way comfort and longing blur when women seek refuge in one another's presence. Yet this intimacy is immediately undercut by revelation, as Charlotte, reassembling herself both physically and emotionally, recognizes an inconsistency in Sam's account of the Polaroids, and this recognition marks a devastating pivot from solace to suspicion. Drawing her weapon on Sam is not an act of aggression but of self-protection, a boundary erected too late, underscoring how trust, once breached, leaves women exposed to both emotional and physical risk. Sam's admission that the police have deliberately looked the other way regarding the powerful Town family crystallizes the film's critique of institutional corruption, aligning it with classic noir while grounding it firmly in a feminist perspective that centers whose suffering is deemed acceptable collateral. Her cynical statement that this is simply the way the world works lands as a generational truth many women recognize, particularly queer women who learn early that justice is unevenly distributed and that complicity is often rewarded more than integrity. For lesbian and LGBTQ+ viewers, this betrayal carries a particular sting, reflecting the painful reality that even within queer-coded connections, systemic allegiance can override personal loyalty. Charlotte's devastation is not only romantic, but existential. The realization that the one place she sought refuge is also compromised, and this collapse mirrors the broader queer fear that there is no truly safe space untouched by power. The final sequence, Charlotte digging a symbolic grave overlooking the valley, shifts the film into Ellie Jack mode, allowing grief to take physical form in an act of solitary ritual. Her voiceover, expressing fear that the towns could take her as they took Veronica and others, articulates a collective anxiety shared by women living under patriarchal systems where disappearance is both literal and metaphorical. The ants scurrying across the ground as she buries Veronica's Polaroid emphasize scale and insignificance, a reminder of how individual lives can be erased quietly, without acknowledgement, and how women's stories are so easily consumed by the landscape of power. Smoking and gazing at the hills, Charlotte embodies exhaustion rather than defeat, a woman who has seen too much to believe in neat resolution yet continues to bear witness. Society's discomfort with women loving women is woven throughout this scene in the way intimacy is permitted only briefly before being punished by revelation, reinforcing the cultural narrative that queer connection is fragile, doomed, or secondary to larger plots of corruption and control. This discomfort persists because women's emotional alliances challenge hierarchies that rely on isolation and competition, and by showing those alliances as both sustaining and vulnerable, the film refuses to idealize them without erasing their necessity. Sam's dual role as lover and agent of the system reflects the impossible positions women often occupy, asked to balance personal ethics with institutional survival, while Charlotte's arc represents the cost of refusing to look away. Veronica, though absent, remains the moral center of the scene, her image buried but not forgotten, symbolizing the countless women whose lives are reduced to evidence rather than honored as stories. For women broadly, this scene resonates as a meditation on how truth-seeking can lead to isolation, and how expressing anger or grief is often pathologized rather than supported. For queer audiences seeking authenticity, the film's refusal to offer redemption through romance or justice through procedure feels honest, acknowledging that visibility does not guarantee safety and that love does not shield one from systemic harm. Yet within this bleakness, there is a quiet affirmation in Charlotte's act of mourning, a refusal to let Veronica vanish without ritual, memory, or witness. By centering a woman alone with her grief rather than closing on spectacle or revenge, Another Night in the Valley insists that bearing witness is itself a form of resistance, and that acknowledging loss without sanitizing it honors the truth of women's lives more fully than false hope ever could.